Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 24th, and we will be hearing the presentation From Isolation to Inclusion, LGBTQ Communities in Planning and Equity Issues. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar. And for your content-related questions for the presentation, you can type those again in that chat box located in your webinar toolbar. We will answer those if time allows at the end of the presentation. Today's webcast is sponsored by a couple folks. We have the APA Northern New England chapter, and we have the LGBTQ division and the Transportation Planning division. So thanks to all of them for hosting today's important session. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts, and there are many more coming down the pipeline here. We're actually scheduled out through the end of July at this point. We're just, continuing to gather up information so we can have registration ready for everybody. And you can register for these webcasts by visiting our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. To log those AICP credits, head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account. And from there, you can either search by today's title or the event number, which is listed there. And if you forget both of them or don't get a chance to write them down, you can find them both on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. I'm gonna go back one slide because I forgot. Oh, nope, I don't even have it listed. Never mind. Let's be friends. Join us on Facebook, Planning Webcast. Just search Planning Webcast on Facebook and we'll pop up. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up along with our almost 3,000 friends and over 300 videos. So be sure to subscribe to our channel. And with that, I'll say that we are recording today's webcast and it will be up on our YouTube channel. We'll also have a PDF of this session available at the conclusion, and it will be at our webcast webpage. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, I think that is it for me and my housekeeping items. So I am going to turn it over to Mark Lewis DeGrace, who will get us started. Mark, I am turning those controls over to you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christine, for putting this all together. My name is Mark Lewis DeGrace. I'm the Professional Development Officer of the National Capital Area Chapter of APA, which is Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and two neighboring suburban counties in the state of Maryland, Montgomery County and Prince George's County. And this webinar came together through the Montgomery County section of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. So thank you to them for finding the speakers and doing a lot of the legwork. As Christine mentioned, this is also being sponsored by the LGBTQ division of APA along with the Transportation division. So thank you for their sponsorship as well. Since we all can't be together in Houston, we're trying to put out as much online content as we can, along with all the divisions and chapters. So we're all trying to just stay strong in these unusual times. And I just wanted to let everyone know this is also being offered for our Play Cousins in Landscape Architecture's ASLA. Information on getting your continuing maintenance credits will be sent out in a separate email after this webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Crane of Montgomery County. And just bear with me 1 second. I'm going to share this with Brian, and you should have control now, Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for logging in, and many thanks to the folks with the APA and helping us organize this afternoon session. So my name is Brian Crane. I'm with the Montgomery County Planning Department. I'm actually, my regular duties are in historic preservation, but as among other duties as assigned, with a lot of other staff at the planning department, I've been working on the update to the county's general plan, and it's within the context of exploring equity issues within our general plan update that we chose to organize this afternoon's session. So I want to give you a little bit of information about our general plan update so you understand the context of what we're hoping to get out of this afternoon's conversation and where we're going to be going from here. So now is my slideshow showing? Am I going to get my face out of the way? All right.
Your face is fine, and your slideshow is just fine. If you want to keep your webcam on, you're more than welcome to do so.
That's okay. All right, great. So so we're calling the update to our general plan Thrive Montgomery Plan 2050, and just all right. So the page down doesn't change the slide. That doesn't change the slide. All right, so how do I change the slide?
Try
there we go. Got it.
with your, oh, okay. Poor Brian. Everyone, Brian and technology have not been friends today. This poor man. Please bear with him.
We've had a few hiccups, but that's fine. We're working through them, and it's going to be great. So just a couple quick points on what is a general plan. So a general plan is a very high level, multi-decade document that provides policy statements and goals and action items to guide growth and development and opportunities and challenges for land use and zoning and transportation and a wide variety of issues for the next, through 2050 for several decades. So it's very important to the county's future, and it touches on a lot of issues. And among the pillars of this plan going forward is equity. We're very well aware that when our first general plan was developed in the 1960s, there were a lot of structural inequalities that affected the residents of Montgomery County, many of them around race as well as ethnicity and gender and other things. And we know that the negative legacy of those inequities persists in our county today, and that if we want all of the residents of this county to thrive going forward, then we need to develop an equity lens through which we see our policy programs so that we can build a county that's more equitable for everyone. So that's one of the things that's really important for our initiative is that we're seeing equity as a major organizing principle, really for the first time in a general plan. And we know that this is something that it takes a lot of attention, and we also know that issues of inequality and equity cut across a lot of different intersections of people's experience. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have a conversation around LGBTQ issues and planning, and think about those going forward is that we know that we want to include outreach to communities that may not have felt a part of the planning process in the past. So that brings us to today. So a little bit of background about general plans in Montgomery County. Our first plan, developed in the 1960s, 64, and then updated a bit in 69, was famous for its wedges and corridors concepts, and was considered groundbreaking at the time, but equity as such wasn't really one of the things, was not one of the major principles that was considered at that time. And we want the Thrive 2050 plan to have that as a core value. So Thrive 2050 has these 3 pillars, where these 3 major lenses through which we're trying to see all of the policy recommendations that we make, see how they affect economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. And as part of this, we've done a lot of community engagement. We've put our materials out in Spanish as well as English. We've targeted a lot of communities that may not have really felt part of the planning process in the past, to make sure that we're hearing a lot of different voices. And we're getting the information out really as broadly as we can, and to as broad an audience as we can. A little bit of background: the county has changed a lot since the 1960s, when our first plan was developed. In 1990, if you look at the map on the left-hand side, it was a majority white county. And if you look at the area that's yellow in these maps indicates an area where no single racial or ethnic group is in the majority. Minority-majority places in the county. So it was very small in 1960. But if you look at the map at the right with 2016 data, you can see that the county has really changed, and that the areas where no single group is in the majority is now a really large part of the county, extending all the way out along the I-270 corridor. Here, we've developed a number of different buckets, if you like that word, that surround our 3 core pillars. So we're looking at complete communities, connectedness, diverse economies, safe and efficient travel, affordability and attainability. We know Montgomery County is an expensive place to live. We want healthy and sustainable environment, diverse and adaptable growth, and good culture and design. The equity working group has been looking a lot, particularly at complete communities and connectedness, and thinking about, well, what makes a complete community, and that may be one that has a wide variety of different housing types and allows for a range of commercial activities and is well connected in transportation. And with connectedness, we know that there may have been design features or practices in our past that maybe didn't connect people, but actually may have served to raise barriers. And we want to barriers to opportunity and barriers to feeling connected and invested in the community. And we want to look at ways that we can build more connected communities as we go forward. So our timeline, we've just last week developed presented draft vision and goals to our planning board and got a lot of constructive feedback from the board. We're working on revising things now, and in the next few months, we'll be developing draft policies and actions and bringing a working draft back to the planning board this this fall, with the goal of bringing that forward to the county council next spring by April of 2021. So it's a pretty aggressive timeline, and so it's something that we're really working very hard on. So in terms of what's next with the sort of LGBTQ initiative that we have developed, we've got this webinar, which is, essentially, as I see it, asking the basic question: what are the LGBTQ issues that really planners should be aware of? What do we need to be thinking about as we're developing this high-level general plan? And then we're going to be carrying that forward, and we're hoping to have, right now we're envisioning potentially 2 more panel conversations that might happen, we hope, in June or July. One would be focused on historic preservation and LGBTQ places. So thinking about placemaking and identifying with a place and all of the opportunities and challenges that are associated with that now. And then also looking at generations. I mean, I think that sometimes when we talk about a lot of the, pretty broad spectrum of experience that the letters LGBTQ, IA+, encompass, that's a broad range of experience, but age is not something that we always consider. And my husband works a lot with LGBTQ seniors, and so I know from his work, he's an attorney for Whitman Walker Health, that isolation is a serious issue for LGBTQ seniors, and it can also be an issue for youth. And so we're looking forward to setting up a conversation that talks about commonalities maybe between the experience of LGBTQ youth and seniors, and what do we learn from that. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. I'm very excited about who we have this afternoon. I think this is really going to be an interesting conversation. So Eric Shaw is an urban planning professional with extensive experience in establishing and leading cross-sector, cross-discipline, and cross-jurisdictional partnerships in the areas of community and economic development. He's been recognized for his work establishing strategic initiatives that support inclusive development and resilience in communities throughout the nation. He has held positions in the public and philanthropic sectors in Salt Lake City, Louisiana, Silicon Valley, and Miami. He is founder and principal of No New Ideas Consulting, and most recently served as director of the Washington, D.C. Office of Planning. Welcome, Eric. Dr. Jeremy Wells is an assistant professor in this historic preservation program in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research focuses on the psychology of heritage places, making the preservation enterprise more equitable, just, and resilient, and innovative community engagement tools for preservation planners. He runs the website, and you can see the URL there on the screen, and to explore these topics with the goal of making historic preservation more human-centered. And I also know that he has been active in developing historic contexts in the city of Baltimore for LGBTQ history. So welcome, Jeremy. Kristen Jeffers is founder and editor-in-chief of the Black Urbanist Multimedia Platform, author of A Black Urbanist, second edition forthcoming, creator of the public speaking course Plan to Speak, and one half of the podcast Third Wave Urbanism, as well as a freelance writer, urban planner, and advocate. She has presented at the annual Congress for New Urbanism, YIMBY Town, and to communities around the US and Canada, using her personal story to illustrate what land use and planning really means and really does, plus encouraging practitioners, both young and old, in best practices. Welcome, Kristen. And lastly, but certainly not least, Yes Segura is a transportation planner who is first-generation El Salvadoran American, but also an openly transgender man. Yes's focus of planning work deals with equity and health within new mobility. Yes's graduate work heavily involved LGBTQ+ planning and self-driving cars policy, urban design work. Yes has won multiple APA awards and an AICP award. Since then, Yes has continued research plus policy work within new mobility with a focus on equity and health. Yes recently helped to establish the Health and Equity Subcommittee within the Autonomous Vehicle Washington State Work Group, and has presented at a United Nations Global Goals Jam in Seattle. So I welcome all and thank all of our awesome panelists, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. And hopefully now I will remember how I pass the baton. All right, so make another attendee the presenter. So Eric, I am passing the baton to you, and welcome, Eric, and thanks for participating with us this afternoon.
I'm ready to take the baton. All right. Well, good morning, you guys. How are you? All right. I hope that you guys can see my screen. Can my screen be seen? Just confirming. Yes?
Yep, you look great.
Perfect. Hi. Well, I'm really excited to be here and to sort of kick off this panel. You know, I think it's great. I've had a chance to actually work with all the people on the panel, except for Jeremy, and my multiple lives that I've had as a planning director. And I'm happy to sort of talk about planning as a practice and planning from the spaces that we're working in to make sure we're working on LGBTQ places and spaces. I've done some fun things in my life. I've actually, you guys saw, I've worked in Silicon Valley and Salt Lake City, most recently planning director for Washington, D.C. And so as a planner, we always think about context. And so I wanted you to know that we're doing this work and talking about this work from the context of Washington, D.C. in 2016, which was a very different place. As you can see, we were talking about marriage equality. We had a president that was talking a lot more about our community and really advancing and investing and making sure that we were included in planning processes and policy. And I think it's important to note that in working in all these different cities, that each of these contexts are different, and that it's important for us to understand how the queer communities, our LGBT communities, have establish themselves based off of where they are and how they're practiced. A lot of folks don't know this, but when I was in Salt Lake City as the director of development, I was represented in local government at every level by a queer person, from school board to neighborhood council to city council to county council. So that really tells you that we need to understand and think about the different places and contexts in which we think. And so we know right now that there's a question that's coming up as neighborhoods have, people become more out, places have been more established and demarcated as neighborhoods or gayborhoods, those terms, that now there was a conversation around sort of LGBTQ people being pioneers, quote unquote, at that time. But now the question for them is around gentrification, around displacement, around identity, and around place. And so we can see right now a lot of conversations happening in the media and amongst our community about the nature and future of gay neighborhoods and queer spaces. And so as a planner, I wanted us to think about and go back to, while there isn't a lot of documentation around these spaces and how they were created, we can look back and understand through other data how these neighborhoods grew. So for example, our staff looked at how the route of the LGBT Pride Parade changed over years to show the expansive either breadth and reach of gay neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. For you guys that have been to D.C. before, in the 2000, the parade actually only went on 17th Street and did not start as far back as on 22nd and P. You can see in 2012 and then 2017, the route changed as well. But for us to sort the map, what are the landmarks, what's the representation of how the neighborhoods and the presence of LGBT communities has expressed itself within the city. We also want to look at, once again, the evolution and respect of the creation of LGBT institutions and the daylighting of more diverse institutions. We know that DC is a very black and white space. In some instances, race and class and sexuality play themselves differently, but we know now that there's been, for as long as there's been sort of mainstream pride, there's also been a black pride. So we can see the evolution of queer communities of color coming out and being represented over the years in Washington, D.C. We also know that within that D.C. was special in the space, that it was one of the few places where women were able to work and get jobs and grow without being married, which meant that we had a very strong political queer women's community from fairly early on because they were able to establish themselves. This is the Furies Collective, which is now one of our LGBT sites. And so as we think about data and we think about this, we want to understand too that there's actually a lot of folks that are doing data. The Pride Study is a national study tracking LGBT health. The Municipal Impact System, HRC, Victory Fund is tracking LGBT elected officials. And the National Black Justice Coalition is tracking, focusing more on queer communities of color and using data. And so that's highlighting some information, in particular there's some work done by my friend Lopez and Chung around communities. And so I think we need to understand that when we think about queer communities, they're not just white and cisgendered and men, that there are, a lot of them have couples, a lot of them, are people of color. Sometimes their incomes are different. And so we need to look at other data that makes us understand the breadth of LGBT communities. And so with that, I want to go into something that was happening in Washington, D.C. at the time. This is a picture of two of my interns. And I had this situation where I ended up having seven interns who all ended up being LGBTQ identified in 2016. And we wanted to figure out a project to really advance the work and priority I had and incorporating LGBT issues into there. And so we tied in a creative placemaking initiative and a partnership with Whitman Walker, who was doing a redevelopment to understand the idea of queer space. Whitman Walker is particularly important because they were helping around HIV, and for a very long time they wanted to be on the fringe, not to be seen. But now they were in the center of a neighborhood that was changing and growing, and they wanted to understand how to be more out as a building and as a development. So we tied with them. So we worked with these artists called No King Selective. These are two straight artists, but they're very cool. And I had a directive for them, which said, I want you to look at this canvas for Whitman Walker, and I want you to make the gayest thing humanly possible. And so this is the picture that I got as a predecessor, and they started working on redeveloping or doing some art that was going to be for a major parking lot. And so this work evolved into the Work It Girl mural, which was huge. We ended up having, they were inspired by RuPaul. They, in the end, used the trans flag colors. And they got so inspired that they wanted to paint the whole canvas. So this became the largest mural on the East Coast, and focused on the evolution of communities of color, of trans colors. And I'm going to show you, taking to heart the model of Whitman Walker, of which we see you. So we went from this idea of isolation and hiding to now really making sure that clients and staff were seen on the street, looking at residents that were coming and being seen and represented as queer and trans and staff and clients. So this was a really powerful space that showed and marked a place and a block within a respective community. Yeah, with that, so what we love in the end is that people love seeing themselves and being seen and establishing a queer space. We wanted to take this from temporary to permanent, so we used 6 weeks of programming to really understand how people use space and understand how to turn that into permanent work. So we had a queer block party. We had the block is hot. We had a queer women of color event. We had a water slide. We had a youth party. But the idea was it was deeply programmed to basically become a queer living room in the center of this very active neighborhood, even with the chandelier. And it was so much fun, by the way. I just wanted to say that. And you can see the scale of both people, of diversity, and of height. And it was so powerful as a queer space. We actually drew a rainbow into it. So I love that you can see the scale of this and this sort of beautiful space of gay on queer on rainbow and representation. And so even when the building was being demolished, we still were able to keep the space available. It still had a presence even as the space was changing and turning into the product of what it was. So this is the final project right now that has been completed and opened. It includes the LGBT museum that's opening up, the offices for Whitman Walker, and then housing and some other spaces. What the community has said and what my interns have realized now was that we wanted to make, instead of isolation looking inward, we wanted to be outward, so almost to create that queer living room in a permanent space, and to have queer demarcation. So the evolution of the design started to show rainbow decor. We kept the idea of the rainbow out and the street being out. And then this now is the living room that now is for programming for people to actively, instead of being inside and afraid, to be outside and on the street, out of the closet and into the streets was the story for Act Up. So this was designed and prototyped by my staff through the work from the artists and my interns into a permanent design. I want to add something just really quickly. I know I'm watching time. This is very untraditional, but it took some queer leadership to get it done. So myself as the openly gay planning director, the openly gay community development director, openly lesbian, put investment money, and the openly gay transportation director all made sure that we got the permits and waivers needed to create this queer space. And then finally, in the end, we've been doing a lot of work on historic context statements, and that was another space for us to think about, not just the future of spaces, but also the history of them. And so we've been actively working now through historic context to designate queer spaces and think about the future of designation of queer spaces. And so two things became very powerful through that work. One was we were able to document the first two-spirited or transgender Native person to have a formal meeting with the president at the White House. This is Wehwa, and they were recognized as a two-spirited person to have a formal thing. We also got something done too, which was Lafayette Square in front of the White House now has a designation with a new LGBT connotation around being a queer cruising ground. So we understand now we had to unpack the idea of sexuality, of space, of preservation, and sort of show how we, as planners, can incorporate this into our planning space, into our lexicon, into our memory, into our history, into our future. And with that, I'm happy to share this with Jeremy, and thank you. Excited for questions going forward.
Okay.
Thank you,
All
Jeremy.
right. All right. Well, thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. So let me go ahead and get the PowerPoint up and going. Okay. All right. So again, my name is Jeremy Wells, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland. And I teach in the historic preservation program, but my background is very strongly centered in planning and the social sciences. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the work that my students did for a preservation studio that is a required component of our course. And so this is happened kind of organically the way this arose, because I had connections at Preservation Maryland. And we just started talking about, what are the needs for the state of Maryland in terms of preservation planning, and it started to really just center around LGBTQ spaces in history. And Preservation Maryland offered some funding, and it just all sort of fell together. And nice small class of students. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is this experience of putting together a plan to focus on LGBTQ heritage in the core of Baltimore that is being used now to help guide Preservation Maryland's activities. So, so this studio, this is a cover and table of contents that shows you the work that the students did in there. Rather comprehensive in terms of what they tried to do, because they had to understand the context of planning itself and the literature that deals with injustices in LGBTQ space, and just simply the recognition of queer history is very difficult. And so they, I think, did a really good job of fleshing that out as a context of the report. And then they go into talking about the history of LGBTQ people and place in Baltimore. And then they focus on what they call a toolkit. And I'll give you some examples of that. But this is meant to be a community guide so that people from the LGBTQ community have the right tools to document the places and spaces that they think are important. And so that's the major goal here. So the participants for the preservation studio. So Catherine Boyle, Ty Ginter, Kelly Haley, Daniela Ty, Kelly Schindler, and Emma Schrantz. These are graduate students in the historic preservation program. And I also pulled in a couple of extra students who were doing an independent study with me, Josette Graham, Kathleen Jockel, and Tamara Schlossenberg, to provide more historical context on issues in LGBTQ planning and historic preservation. And so they, again, just did a fantastic job on this particular report. The organizations that helped make this come together, the Pride Center of Maryland, they recently changed their name, were a really key partner in this. We held community workshops in this particular area, and they have a history, this organization has a history going back to the 70s in terms of LGBTQ people and advocacy. And so they made a really ideal partner for this particular work. Again, Preservation Maryland and also Baltimore Heritage were also partners in this particular project. So again, the goal of what the students were doing was to create a toolkit to document places that are associated with LGBTQ heritage in Baltimore, specifically for Preservation Maryland. And there were three things that they had to focus on this. The first is providing this context for something called the authorized heritage discourse, which this is coming from an area in preservation that is called critical heritage studies, that has had so far a rather minimal influence on preservation practice in the US, much more of a large factor in terms of preservation planning in Australia and in Europe. But what this states is that the professional practice of historic preservation encompasses a value and a meaning system. You can think of it sort of as a culture. So rather than the value system that is ingrained in preservation doctrine and in the rules and regulations that we use, like the Secretary of the Interior standards and National Register criteria, rather than being grounded in some sort of objective kind of scientific route, this is a way of looking at preservation doctrine and the resulting regulations as a community of practice that has been defined in historic preservation. So it really emphasizes the idea of objective art historical values isn't so interested in community engagement. But the idea is that if the community wants to engage with preservation practitioners, especially if there's some sort of regulatory system in place, like design review at the local level, those members of the public have to speak in the language of this professional heritage discourse, which again is Secretary of the Interior standards or National Register criteria. And so it's a way of, authorized heritage discourse is a way of describing a system in historic preservation that disempowers just general members of the community and substantially disempowers marginalized members of our communities. So this is a large reason why we have huge deficits in diversity and preservation. 95% plus of all of the places in the National Register of Historic Places are solely related to the history of rich white men. LGBTQ history is less than 1% in the National Register. We have huge issues with something called historical integrity, where because a lot of the places associated with LGBTQ history have very low amounts of integrity, they've changed a lot over time. They're very difficult to get officially recognized in the National Register, in our local registers. And then coupled with that is the fact that the history of LGBTQ people is just not well documented. You're not going to find a well-defined written record in a historical archive. Mostly it's going to be oral history. And again, part of the authorized heritage discourse in historic preservation is that we deprecate oral history. It's a second-class citizen. It is next to impossible sometimes to even get a property listed in the National Register of Historic Places if you're only looking at oral history. So that's the context for this, and that's the context for LGBTQ history and historic preservation. So I've already mentioned the deficit in preservation practice and also in scholarship. It's only really been in the past 5 years that you can actually find scholarly literature that talks about the issues of historic preservation and LGBTQ places in history. And the last thing that the students were focusing on is grassroots efforts. They wanted to engage the members of the LGBTQ community in recognizing and understanding what was important about these places and helping them to articulate that. So in this way, the students function very much as facilitators. So where the students got their data from, they did a lot of interviews of local members of the LGBTQ community. They did go into historical archives, and there are a number of gay newspapers, especially in the DC area, that talked about some of the social events and happenings that were happening in Baltimore and the gay and lesbian scene in Baltimore, like in the 70s and the 80s. So they used some of those materials, but they relied a lot, again, on oral history. And they focused on the case study of a gay bar called the Hippo that was recently closed in Baltimore. Which is obviously unfortunate, but it was a great case study they focused on. So as part of this planning process, the students put together a community workshop, and so invited members of the LGBTQ community to share their history of places. And the students divided people up into both geographies of Baltimore, but also place themes. So for instance, like bars and churches and affirming different kinds of other affirming places, LGBTQ organizations. So all these people talking about the history centered around this idea of place-centered storytelling to uncover really what are some substantial hidden histories on LGBTQ heritage in the central part of Baltimore. And the results were really very interesting because within marginalized communities, I think all of us in planning know this, that there's kind of these layers of marginalized histories, that even within marginalized communities, there's marginalization happening within those marginalized communities. And that's what the students uncovered here, that the only secondary sources for LGBTQ history that focus on Baltimore are really only talking about the history of usually white gay males. So what the students uncovered through the research is there's a whole untold history of African-American gay and lesbian history in Baltimore that many people didn't even know about. And so in their report, this is the first time in a published form, the African-American LGBTQ community has actually been discussed and documented in terms of their experiences, but very much in terms of their experiences of oppression and marginalization within the LGBTQ community in Baltimore. Because if you were African American, you went to your places, because the white LGBTQ community didn't, in many cases, invite you into like bars that were only for white people. And so there's all these sorts of histories of if you were African American, you had a higher bar to be able to enter in, the bar was raised higher against you to be able to enter into a bar, because you had to have all these different types of ID, or you had to be wearing the right sorts of clothes. Very interesting just reading about this. So again, really important history that was revealed by the students. And then their toolkits. So in this studio report, they focus on how to engage just regular members of the public, how to document LGBTQ history in place. And so they gave some tips on how you do interviews of members of this community to be able to deal with what are obviously going to be very personal, very sensitive histories that you need to treat, obviously, in a discreet way. They defined how you do archival research, some places that you might find written documentation on LGBTQ history in the state of Maryland. So this is where their case study of the Hippo came into play. And so this is some of the ephemera from the Hippo, some advertisements and some photographs. They talked about physically documenting places, how you do hand drawings, and if you have the skills and the expertise, you can do major drawings and 3D sketches and so forth. They created a 3D rendering of the Hippo that is included in the report, and there's also some additional documentation that you can access on this. And in the end, the students had two groups of recommendations for people who are interested in documenting LGBTQ history in place within historic preservation. And the first thing they recommended is start with community engagement first. So this is a ground-up grassroots effort. The second recommendation is you need to be sensitive, you need to be flexible, and have an open-mindedness to what you might uncover. And so, push any biases or preconceived notions to the side, especially in terms of what histories you might be uncovering. The third recommendation was related to this and planning for the unexpected. And the fourth recommendation is that whatever the outcome of this, it has to have some sort of a public entity representation that is helping people to learn about the importance of this history. And the last recommendation they gave was a focus on what everyday people can do. So in historic preservation practice, we have this really strong emphasis on the involvement of professionally trained individuals. But in this report, what the students were doing is empowering everyday people to be able to do this. And so encouraging people to explore their local LGBTQ history, look at other projects like LGBT New York City historic sites projects. There's a lot of online documentation of this kind of history. And when you look at the history of historic sites, there's these coded phrases: confirmed bachelors, supposedly straight white people, which dominate historic preservation, may have this hidden history, and we're beginning to uncover this. And so lastly, just encouraging students to be able to get involved in a local history project and do this kind of work. The URL on the screen is where you can download this report if you want to see a copy of it, as well as some additional data. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation off to Kristen Jeffers, and thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me at least? All right, so let me get my screen up here, and let's see, I'm hearing an echo. Let's see.
It might go away. Keep talking. I
Okay,
hear
great.
the echo too.
Okay.
But we didn't
All
hear it before.
right.
I think it might be gone.
Okay, great. So yes, welcome again, everybody. I am Kristen Jeffers, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And so I'm going to kind of start taking this webinar into more of a very personal direction. I'm a firm believer that for me, planning is personal. Planning is something that has always been part of my life, even if it hasn't been called planning. And so when I talk about this experience, and if anyone has seen me present, this is going to feel very familiar. This is going to feel similar to things I've said before, done before. But specifically this afternoon, I want to talk about how our experiences of planning are. I'm going to make sure I'm staying in time here. So I'm going to turn my timer on. So I want to talk specifically about my own experience, my own coming out. For some folks, this is new information, and also maybe new information for your community. Also, I've used some words on this first slide here that may be unfamiliar terms in identity. And I wanted to use this slide to also introduce the fact that even within our community of planners, how we talk about our own lives and how that lens informs our lives and our planning and working with communities does have an effect on things. And so for anybody, it's great to ask. First and foremost, ask your community, listen, and I'll emphasize that as I get to the end of my slide. My information is at the bottom there. This is in Kansas City, Missouri, one of the many places I've worked over the years. So let me get to the past, and this is my past, and it'll be my present, and then I'll have some things I want for the future of planning, not just how we interact with people, but internally within our family of planners, both APA and AICP and our other friends who are joining us, how we do our practice as practitioners of place, no matter what we use and where our practicing is coming from. So in my past, I was born in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina. I was born in 1985, and I was born into a two-parent family, a Black family that has generations of land rights on both sides. And of course, when I mean land rights, I mean right to ownership. At least since Reconstruction on both sides of my family, there have been people living and cultivating farmland in some form, shape, or fashion. So I'm moving to this next slide. So this is where you see the red dot there. That's the particular plot where my father grew up. At the time when my father was born in 1960 through the 1960s and 70s, and also somewhat into the 80s, this land was not this developed. And so basically what you're looking at here was farmland, primarily farmland owned by African-American families. This is also not officially part of Greensboro. Those of you who know history around the Greensboro area, this would be the Guilford College area. And so basically what's happened around my dad's family is having industrialization, suburbanization, and then also just still certain plots that haven't been touched yet. And so there's always been pressure, and there's always been talk in my family about, how our land and our communities are effectively being squeezed out, but it's a different type of squeezing out, or some would say gentrification or displacement that you may have some may be used to if you're working in more, I would say, legacy urban environments. Now, Greensboro it was established in 1808. Our downtown area is very well plotted and planned, and there have been institutions that have left that area. But as we suburbanize, as we've absorbed farmland, this is the context that effectively my dad was born into. And then when I was born, some of the things like the apartments you see kind of in the middle of the screen, they weren't even there. So I've seen this property in this area change rapidly, even in my own lifetime. So moving on to where my mother grew up, this is in southern Alamance County, which for those of you who need a geography lesson, so Greensboro is the center of the state. It is the Piedmont Triad. My APA NC folks listening, of course, you know exactly where we are here, but you can also help for context here. Alamance County is just to the east of Guilford County, where Greensboro is. Burlington is the central city there. Graham is the county seat. This is down Route 49, and so out kind of in a more rural space. Now, not every land plot that is shown here is family land, but a great deal of it has family members on it, especially towards the lower end of your screen. All that land there was land that I grew up playing across. I used to run across what was then a dirt road. Even into the early 90s, that was a dirt road, a Patterson Road. Patterson is my grandmother's maiden name. And so at the time of when my grandparents were coming up, when my mom was coming up, it was Route 2 Snow Camp, North Carolina. But then over time, road names have changed. And so that was the context. So my family has been in a rural context and a But then they raised me in a more suburban context. This is another part of Southwest Greensboro that I wanted to highlight. I wanted to highlight it because the South Point Apartments was a place that I lived. My parents ended up divorcing, and so when that first happened, my mom and I, we moved to those apartments, and then later my mom purchased a home in sort of the northeastern corner of the screen. I'm preserving my mom's privacy here just so that no one just decides to Google her house and show up and knock on the door. And then there's also those of you who are familiar with Greensboro or familiar with the Four Seasons Mall, one of our major regional shopping malls is there. And then also this I-73 spur is another example of how life has changed since I lived there. I-73 was a plan in the books. Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is over on your left side of your screen, was my home childhood church where I was baptized. My father, who's passed away, is buried there. That between the time I was baptized in the mid-90s and the time my father passed away in 2013, that road had been put in. And then I want to also point out on the screen the Hemp Hill Branch Library, which was not a resource that was there when I lived there. Even though I'm very much a bookworm, that's what brought me into planning and into this space. And it was it replaced two branch libraries that were 2 miles away, a mile in each direction away from each other. But effectively, my context of planning, urban land use, landscape architecture, whatever anyone has using to come to this kind of conversation, this was my context. It was not high density. It was not, it was suburbanized. It was incorporated in the way that things are in North Carolina. We have counties. Counties tend to see the cities. We have an all-encompassing school district that both of my parents worked in. So that was the context that I grew up in. But what ultimately led to my graduate study was I really grew up not thinking that planning was real and planning was a real industry. But during the Great Recession, after graduating from NC State University with a communication degree, after having thought I was going to go into the College of Design, not in architecture or landscape architecture, but I thought I was going into graphic design because ultimately, and as I get into my present work, I'll talk about that. How my planning practice has evolved has been into media. And it was also during my graduate studies that I started to get sort of my first rumblings that I also might not just be a Black woman, but a Black queer woman. And I did my graduate study at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I did it in the Master of Public Affairs department with a concentration in community and economic development. At the time, that was not a degree that on the original rules of APA would lead you directly to certification in a timely manner. So that was also part of me creating these platforms and creating my own path to planning and bubbling up from having these terms not just being part of my graduate study at UNCG, not just being part of even my urban studies classes, but being part of our dinner table conversation. People would see me doing things. My family members would see me at First Friday every week. My family members remember me when I still lived in Greensboro, and I lived in Greensboro as an adult after my time in Raleigh at NC State from 2009 to 2015 when I moved to Kansas City, and then I moved to the DC area about a year and a half later in 2016. And so these were the things that we talked about. And just because I've always just had this inkling and this gift and this just idea of creating. And so that's what led me to what is still my present. Of course, I did finish my degree at UNCG. I graduated from that in 2012. I worked for a number of nonprofits, architecture firms. Some of you remember my time in KC at Bike Walk KC. Some of you remember me at the NC Humanities Council with some other firms. But all the time I had created in the background the multimedia platform, which is the Black Urbanist, which is at Black Urbanist on Twitter, which is also an Instagram and also a weekly newsletter. And effectively, this is what I've landed on why I'm doing it. And I'm also in the process of adding back. Some of you remember my podcast, others not. I had a podcast and I'm adding back a podcast and audio component. Effectively creating media that helps those who are in the planning profession understand what we do and how that is related to what what's going on in society, as well as for us in the field to have a place to go that represents, represents specific identities, such that just like as the last presenter was saying, that we don't have this erasure. My goal was to create media, have it out there, be clear about who I was, and also bring myself fully to the table. And of course, now opening up tables. And so the other thing that I'm doing now specifically is I'm actually digging a little deeper down to create. I very much respect oral history as a tradition, but I'm incorporating a lot of oral history that I'm learning from this survey that I'm doing currently. And I will have a link to some of these resources at the very end of my slide set. And basically, am surveying Black women, and I am to see if I can learn more, and I can provide even more support for us in planning and architecture and development, and also out in the world. And so that's information that's going to be reported, and I'm going to compile all of that. That's what the survey looks like. And then I'm exploring the feasibility of creating a place, a hard place in time within the women identified lesbian bisexual community. Our spaces are still reducing themselves. I know we've talked about neighborhoods. As far as women-led, women-specific spaces, even though here in DC we've added a couple back, in a lot of other places they no longer exist. Major cities are without safe women's spaces to be themselves. So I'm hoping to take some of the things I've done online over the past 10 years and explore the feasibility of creating an actual headquarters, and that headquarters, sort of like how we just saw in another presentation, the Walker Whitman building is also a community center. Whatever I'm doing, wherever I base myself, I've created a community center. And so this is also what my textile business looks like. This is me sitting in Baltimore, actually at the original, well, I wouldn't say the original, the second Red Emma's, doing a presentation. So I hope to build a center where there's books and there's a place for people to come and present. I want to definitely highlight some things I think we need to do as planners in the future. And as we practice, and I hope that this webinar and many other webinars and being involved in the section, the LGBTQ section of APA and the equivalent of ASLA, that we think about how our bias, not just our bias outside, but even internally in the LGBTQ community, how these things show up and how we create maps, how we do our public meetings, surveys, our hiring practices, even methods like this. Just be mindful and do our best to continue to be inclusive in what we're doing. Specifically, people are not going to look a certain way, sound a certain way, be a certain way. And I want to highlight this specifically, and I know Yes is going to get into this specifically around his story, but I want us to be mindful of that, supporting our constituents. If someone is at a public meeting and someone's getting heckled for what they look like, and of course we're already thinking about this on a racial level, on a immigration status level, but also as we think about how people present themselves and how they present themselves maybe differently or what we would call non-conforming, and supporting that in spaces that may be favorable to community development and other factors, say churches, but not necessarily friendly to LGBTQ affirmation in other work that they do, and being mindful that there may be people who don't want to associate with our efforts, and we don't want to lose efforts. The planning efforts that you have, that you're doing, are valid. And because so many of us in the LGBTQ community from years documented have been organizing in networks, from things like ACT UP during the high AIDS era to now with mutual aid, being able to go in and listen and center and include and share resources as we do our own comprehensive plans, as we do our own updates, as we think about zoning changes and needs. So with that being said, that is my information. I want to highlight that I have a link here to a syllabus I created with some books and podcast, and it's a living document. And if anybody wants that information, I'm also going to tweet out that link so you can also see that as well. And of course, you can follow me at Black Urbanist on Twitter, and You can email me directly at the email that is shown. And now I'm going to give the floor with a few seconds to spare to Yes. All right.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. Let's see. I need you all to see the other screen. How we do this? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kristen. I can't tell if I want to stand up or sit down. I think I'll stand up for this. All right, so my name is Yesagura. The MSP stands for Master of Science in Planning. I'm an autonomous vehicle transportation planner and founder of Smash the Box, which is my consulting business here that's based out of Seattle, Washington. I provide autonomous vehicle transportation planning services with a health and equity framework, along with GIS, website design, and graphic design. You can find my information at yesagura.com. I want to give a big thank you to Montgomery Planning Department, along with the 2 divisions within APA, LGBTQ division and the Transportation division. You can find them on Facebook and or by going to the APA website. The same goes for APA National Capital Area Chapter and APA Ohio. Thank you so much for doing this, y'all. Okay, so my parents moved from El Salvador to America in the late 60s. They had my 2 older sisters up in Jersey, and they had me and my little sister in Richmond, Virginia. Now, the plan was to come out as lesbian after I graduated with my bachelor's in science from Virginia Commonwealth University. Well, that did not happen. I, at the time, was dating this girl, and I brought her to my house, and my parents told me to my face that they never wanted to see me or speak to me again. I also had my brother-in-law tell me that I was worthless and I wasn't going anywhere with my life. So I took that with a lot of grain of salt, and I ended up turning it into something that I would say I started believing in myself. I was homeless at the time. For about a good year, I was working full-time and going to school full-time. So with taking that negative energy, I turned it into something positive with believing in myself. And I started the Urban Studies Student Association at VCU. I also started Girls Rock Camp, Richmond, Virginia. Helped to co-found that nonprofit. All right. So made amends with my family, but there was still the don't ask, don't tell policy going on in my household where, couldn't really talk about sexuality or me as being a lesbian at that time. But sooner or later, I had to come out to them again eventually. But while I was at Florida State University to get my master's in urban regional planning, I was specifically interested in understanding how LGBTQ plus communities were being planned for. I kind of figured that, wow, this is probably not going to make me any money after I graduate. So I should probably do this studio where I'm working with Florida Department of Transportation on identifying policies and infrastructure investments for self-driving cars. That has ended up getting an AICP award and with a couple of APA awards. But also during this time, I decided to come out for the second time to my family and to my friends. So with knowing that there was very little resources in the South in general, and that were accessible to me as a transgender man, I had to kind of navigate the world on my own. So I put some resources up here that I believe are very applicable that are accredited, put it that way, that I would highly recommend. The first being Trans Bodies and Trans Selves, a resource for the transgender community. I would see that as an encyclopedia in which you can use for acronyms that you're not familiar with some policy, and then even understanding what's happening at grassroots level. Now, when it comes to policy nationwide for transgender issues that are happening right now and have happened in the past, I would highly recommend looking into the Williams Institute. They have a whole website that just garners towards all of that. Now, if you are, here we go. If you are interested in understanding, in understanding the snapshot of which is the most progressive state in our nation, that has the transgender laws that are going to cover you for housing, for non-discrimination for jobs and whatnot, and for health, then I would look into the Movement Advancement Project by Transgender Law Center. Okay, so I graduated in 2015 December with the master's, and I had decided, okay, let me just start applying for jobs. So I applied for a job in Orlando, Florida, and they told me that I was the top out of 250 people to, stand out for this one job. It was a GIS transportation planning job. So I went down there and I was filling out the HR sheet, which had said, have you used any previous names in the past? Of course, I wanted to be honest, and legally I had to tell them that, hey, just let you know, this is what you'll find, blah, blah, blah. Nothing to worry about, really. The HR person that I talked to before the interview ends up going to talk to the person that was giving me the interview, who was the woman that owned that engineering and transportation firm in Orlando. Now, while I was there, I had the awesome opportunity of going to this Latinx bar themed night that was in Orlando, and I had a blast. It was a really neat space that they had cultivated there in Orlando. Now, about a week later, I found out, I got a nice little phone call from the people that had done the interview, and that they told me that they wished that I didn't tell them who I was, and that that's not discrimination because they're a woman-owned firm. A couple months later, I'm really happy I didn't get that job, because that bar that I had went to was Pulse. And of course, Pulse happened during Latinx night. And being someone that's Latinx, I probably wouldn't even be here being able to tell the story that I am now. So I'm very grateful for that. But I think definitely when we're talking about LGBTQ history, that is something that needs to be indicated and brought to forth, of exposing what type of discrimination that we have gone on with in the 21st century. So I decided, okay, I'm going to pack up all my stuff, put in my car, and then drive from Richmond to go see fam, Tallahassee, Florida, to pick up all my stuff, and then drive all the way up to Seattle, because that's the research that I did, finding that I wasn't going to be, there was job non-discrimination laws, health laws, and housing laws that would respect me treat me as a human being. So I had to act fast when it came to building my network in Seattle. So I joined the Young Professionals in Transportation Seattle as a volunteer, and right now I'm actually the chair of the nonprofit. I also joined the Young Professionals in Transportation International, and I am the director of communications for that international nonprofit. Now, I had to make some kind of money. I ended up joining and driving for Uber for a bit. So I did that for about a year and a half. And yes, I do have crazy stories with that. But I was really interested in understanding people's perception when we were talking about self-driving cars. So from that, I ended up taking that research and then doing presentations, got picked up by Curbed. They wrote an article on me, same with GeekWire, Lime. I did presentations at AIA Seattle, along with Global Goals Jams, which is a United Nations event. And then also presented at Hindsight Conference, which, if y'all don't know about this is the largest equity urban planning conference that is hosted by the American Planning Association, New York chapter, and then their diversity committee. Okay. While also in Seattle, I have had the opportunity of just really spearheading some really cool events. And one of them has been the intersections of displacement, transportation, and the LGBTQ community here in Seattle. So what are the connections with understanding how our community is being impacted when it comes to transportation? I got some panelists from Seattle Department of Transportation to help answer that question of how we're being included in that conversation, but also people from the Chamber of Commerce. So just understanding local businesses that in Seattle, we have the largest nationwide Chamber of Commerce that includes the LGBTQ community. Just last year, I was working for Alta Planning and Design for a short little small contract where I got to work with King County Metro and their transportation demand management project. So I was going out and doing door-to-door outreach and just helping people in the neighborhood, in the communities, to better understand what their transportation options are and some of the new transportation options. One of the concerns that I found was that there was actually a blind transgender woman that was attacked on one of the buses. And this is something as somebody that is part of the community. And when I see news like this is something that it's our obligation to bring to the table so that we can address this in some form or matter. So like I said, I moved to Seattle. I had to start from nothing. So since 2016, I applied for 160 jobs. Like, no joke, y'all. I have even created a Google Drive document. I'm really thorough with my documentation and whatnot. So I have that there, and I'm just thinking, wow, what's going on? And just knowing that on social media, you can really find anybody. And when it comes to my information, I'm making sure that I am the most truest to myself. So I make sure to identify that I'm openly transgender man, proud, first generation El Salvadorian American, and whatnot. So that's where I started thinking, okay, there has to be some reason why I'm not landing a job. Like, what's going on? I have AICP award. I've done United Nations presentations. What's going on? So that's when I started looking into data. So in 2015, the National Center for Transgender Equality released their largest, it's actually nation's largest survey on transgender people, and it has collected at over 27,000 applicants, and just trying to understand where we are at as a community nationwide. I also started looking into legal information just to see where states were at with what discrimination policies are being put forth by Congress in each state. So Lambda Legal is a great resource there. And then I was trying to figure out, well, why aren't we being counted in the census? And I'm not the only one that is wondering that. Why aren't we counting gender identity and sexuality in our census? Well, the National LGBT Task Force is doing that. So if you want any information, I would highly recommend looking into the Movement Advancement Project. So going back to trying to figure out why am I not getting hired? Well, finding out from that National Center for Transgender Equality report that was put out in 2015, the transgender unemployment rate is actually 3 times higher than the average American. Started looking into more LGBTQ plus data, and this is the most. These are some of the most recent ones that I have been just like doing my ongoing research of trying to understand, where people at when it comes to identifying as LGBTQ plus within our urban planning industry. And I found that the APA Texas chapter did a diversity and inclusion report where they actually did include people that are transgender and gender non-conforming. Now, with that, given only one person actually identified as transgender in that survey, so the survey really doesn't, yeah, y'all get it. earlier this month, I attended a UCLA Understanding How Women Travel seminar that was put on by, I believe, is a Women's in Transportation Seminar, WTS. They're a great organization. And a professor from UCLA within the urban planning department put together this report of understanding how women travel. And that was just released earlier this year. Now, she talked about ways of collecting gender identity and sexuality and some of the issues that came along with it. So I would look into that. Another one that I was actually looking into this type of data was trying to understand how's LGBTQ planning or LGBTQ community giving feedback when it came to Seattle's comprehensive plan. And so the Seattle LGBTQ Commission provided some recommendations in 2015, which you can find on their website. Okay, this is another topic I wanted to touch on. So I touched on my story along with some LGBTQ plus data, but also what's going on with the pandemic that we're in now. So by far the most prevalent relief fund major resource that I've seen for our community was only open for 4 days. The application for it was only open for 4 days, and I'm talking about the COVID-19 relief fund for LGBTQI plus BIPOC folks. And this was started by someone in California. Her name, or their name, forgive me, I don't know their pronouns, are Amita Swadhin. They've received over 3,000 applicants, and from those 3,000 applicants, the request was a total of over $2 million. And so right now what they're doing is that they're making sure to give each person that applied at least $100. I have the link to understanding how they have been doing that whole process right underneath their name. Now with Ingersoll Gender Center, that's more Seattle or the state of Washington focused. That is our transgender nonprofit resource that we have here. And what they have done is put together a COVID-19 response program in which they're providing people that need it $500 in rent, which that's pretty big. I mean, I live with 6 or 5 people right now, and I pay $695. So rent over here is pretty expensive. They also have COVID-19 weekly info calls if you're interested. Now, when it comes to Pride events, a bunch of my friends we were watching RuPaul's Drag Race, as we do on the weekends, and I was just wondering, what's going to happen with Pride, because Pride in Seattle is our largest event that we have throughout the whole city. So, of course, this year is going to be our 46th year of Pride. Of course, it has been not canceled, but it's being revived in a different way where we're going to have it virtually. And we have about an estimated of 500,000 people that attend this event. And one thing that I've noticed with gathering data is that if you go to data.seattle.gov and look up special events, this is where you as Seattle Pride have to provide the information of population count that you believe is estimated to be there at that event in order to provide the resources such as closing down the roads or any type of safety or health resources that would be needed for those particular days. So what's going on at national level? Of course, things are happening. Now, what I found interesting about the reports that have been going out about LGBTQ communities and how we're being impacted by COVID-19, well, they're just based on understanding our past history of us having being really discriminated within health insurance policies and not being able to access those resources that we should have. So these reports here are just saying exactly that we are being impacted, even though there's no collection of gender identity or sexuality when you're going to get the COVID-19 test. It is just pretty prevalent in understanding that this is the correlation that's happening. with that, it's the end of my presentation. I want to say transgender people are unstoppable. You are unstoppable. And thank you all so much for attending this event.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm going to turn my my camera back on and ask the panelists to do the same. So that was super. A lot of really thought-provoking stuff in there. We just have a few minutes left for questions. I'm going to sort of take a few of mine and kind of mash them together. So so I'm working with the equity working group for the Montgomery County Planning Department. And one of the big themes that we're focused on for our particular contribution to the general plan conversation is connectedness. How do we foster communities where people feel connected? And I know that sort of in a sometimes I've heard the word, a post-neighborhood world, that we're the LGBTQIA plus communities, plural, are diverse and dispersed. And so I'm wondering, is your what's your top word of wisdom for us in Montgomery County planning as we're thinking about community connectedness? What tools do we have available to help a diverse set of communities feel connected to and invested in and part of their communities? And maybe I'll sort of steer it first to yes. What should we be thinking about for our transportation initiatives, to help people feel connected? Is there some particular tools you might recommend beyond what you've talked about already?
I mean, when it comes to tools, I would say it's just more from understanding your community itself, identifying those cultural hubs. What are the main LGBTQ stakeholders in the area, and starting from there, inviting them to all of your events, keeping them on that listserv, and then even following up with them. But it like I said, this is something that we haven't done in the past. So now is our opportunity to go move forth and create a way so we're including our voices. So any place to start is great, but I mean, strategically about it, hit up those main cultural, those stakeholders that have already established a relationship with the community.
Right. Kristen, what would you add? What words of wisdom for those of us in the equity working group for Montgomery County? We want connected communities.
So as someone who also practices as a journalist, as a media person, I think we need to be monitoring social media as well as things like City Paper and, with, I want to also shout out Dan Reed's blog, Just Up the Pike, and some of the other blogs that are specific to Montgomery. And since you asked about Montgomery County, just specific, there's a very vast blogosphere of Montgomery County folks. And of course, some people lurk in the greater Washington comments. So and people still post flyers in various different languages. So I think just looking at what's being reported. Also, unfortunately, you may want to look at crime stories, especially since we've had here in the DC region, we've had a rash of transgender women, Black transgender women who have been murdered, especially along the Eastern Avenue line. And where basically people who are quoted as friends and family members, even things like the Blade and Tag, these still are LGBTQ media that mentions where people are going and where people are doing things, because people are doing things anyway, even though we're catching up in the planning world. People are doing things. Look at those media sources and you'll find folks.
Super. Just going back up, Jeremy, you already talked to us about recognizing places. So are there some other tools or success stories you might share with us?
Well, there's interesting projects internationally. One of the things that, if you look at just general broader social inclusion, UNESCO is trying to encourage an approach called the historic urban landscape approach. And Ballarat, Australia, of all places, redid their entire, essentially it's a version of their general comprehensive plan with incredible amounts of community engagement, including every marginalized group they could identify, from Aboriginal people, LGBTQ people, people of color, that created this new way of looking at cultural heritage, and they've really upended the whole regulatory environment. So it's one of these things. I'm waiting for a municipality in the U.S., could be Montgomery County, to revisit, the regulatory system of preservation. To what extent is it actually an inadvertent tool for social injustice?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely
would be revisiting the requirement for historical integrity. There's no legal requirement that municipalities or counties in the U.S. must adopt a federal system for preservation. If you want federal money and stuff, okay, different.
Right.
But we don't have to. So it's an open window, and wait for someone to take advantage of it.
Super. Eric, closing thoughts. I think we're just down to the last couple minutes here.
No, yeah, I think we're really on the last minute. So we looked at San Francisco. San Francisco has a trans cultural district. They have a leather cultural district. They have Castro as a cultural district. And when we asked them what they do with them, they're still figuring it out, but they were using designations that already existed to show these places were important. And so I think sometimes use the tools you have and build the narrative afterwards, but know that we need to protect them and we need to lift them up. So I think those are important places.
Super.
That's too quick.
So yeah, I think that we're just about out of time. I want to thank all our panelists and my colleagues at the planning department. This was super, everybody. A lot of food for thought for us, and I hope everyone here came away with something. I don't know if anything else that we needed to? Christine, you want to?
I was gonna say,
Yeah, sure. Yes. Do you have a final comment first?
I was gonna say, can we get a screenshot of all of us?
Yeah, I can do that from my end. Yes, of course. That's funny. Everyone, thanks for joining us. This was great. And just a reminder, there will be an email follow-up with ASLA information for our friends over there that want to get continuing education for that. And we have 1.5 CM credits for AICP as well. Just remember to log those. We'll have a recording of this up on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast, and we'll also have a PDF on our webcast webpage. And for those of you that didn't get their questions answered, just reach out directly to one of these folks to answer your questions. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us today. This was really super. And everyone, be safe, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Hopefully this isn't the last time we see this group together.
That'd be great.
All right, guys, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.